Okay, in the final part of today's content, I want to just discuss a couple more aspects of the correlation of consumption and sensation, and the way that we experience pleasure in particular. So, I suppose one of the aspects that we need to think about here is, what are some of the personal benefits of consumption? It's not all about being a zombie, a dupe, or a cyborg, and that we actually do experience, pleasure when doing forms of consumption, and whether that's the pleasure of buying a record and really enjoying it, going on holidays and relaxing, having a very satisfying meal. Going out and having more hedonistic pleasures in terms of getting drunk or whatever. These consumption practices, the sensations that we experience while we do them, are certainly in many instances pleasurable. And I think this is often disappears out of much of the philosophical and critical literature on this. So again, while the likes of the Frankfurt School would say that the pleasure we experience is through false needs, they're actually wants. If the experience is actually pleasurable and it makes us happy, is that necessarily a problem? As some of the reading in the course points out, much of the ways that the idea that consumer culture provides us pleasure is through the notion of desire. And we'll look at Zygmunt Bauman's work later in the course in particular that discusses that in some detail. There's often some real sexual connotations around the ways that we think about the consumer experience. Now, this is particularly exploited in advertising, where there's that notion, the pleasurable notion of being seduced and then consummating that relationship is used in the advertising industry in particular. The notion, and to try and relate how fantasies of going to want to make us happy will be kind of satisfied through the purchasing of a product. So ads in this sense, in the pleasure that they and the consumer experiences provide us, really relate to our kind of more romantic self, not that rational Homo economicus, but they tend to relate to our psychic reality, our fantasies and our desires more than our as much as our material reality. And again, it's important to show how those two things relate, right? Of course, our psychic reality of, say, wanting to have a particular status will obviously relate to the material reality. But in terms of the feelings and the emotions that are produced in these situations, it relates to the kind of psychic side. Many consumption experiences kind of invoke a kind of feeling of fantasyland or a space of fantasyland, whether it's fun parks and shopping centres, sports stadiums, nightclubs. These things are kind of produced, they're made to take us out and make us feel like we're not part of the real world, and they're particularly to make us feel like that we're not at work, I suppose, is one way of thinking about that. Now, a key notion of considering pleasure, particularly in consumer culture, is through the notion of carnival. And Bacton's work is particularly influential here. And this is, again, the notion that transgression, being in those liminal spaces that don't feel like being in the real world, having the ability to kind of, push limits, to maybe perform ourselves in a way that, we wouldn't do in our day-to-day lives, is particularly pleasurable. Here you can think of kind of the sex, drugs and rock and roll notion of hedonism, of instant gratification, of bodily pleasure through notions of sex, drugs and rock and roll. But also in terms of different spaces again, the beach, nightclubs, raves, strip joints, brothels, even things like Occupy Wall Street as a form of political protest was kind of shown to be actually be really enjoyable for those doing it, because it was this kind of carnivalesque, almost like camping atmosphere in some ways. Certainly, extreme risk takings, extreme sports, jumping off cliffs and base jumping, parachuting, skiing, big wave surfing and stuff like that are seen as kind of having these carnivalesque transgressive notions. Particularly putting yourself at risk of death is particularly transgressive. So these spaces offer up possibilities that are outside social norms, and even offer, in some ways, the possibility of political subversion, but certainly, we experience these things through forms of bodily sensation and pleasure. But there's often, negative sides to this. Much carnivalesque space seems to rely on the objectification or exploitation of bodies, particularly women's. And these spaces themselves, over the past couple of decades in particular, have become increasingly rationalised, become under surveillance, legislation and laws. And we can hear this often, with, calls about the nanny state and the like. So when it comes to the notion of the carnival, many question today whether there's any spaces left that has the kind of carnival kind of nature of transgression and, spaces that have kind of left us to be free to pursue those things. Have they been McDonaldized and co-opted? And, does the heavy regulation of spaces in particular make these kind of notion of transgression harder and harder to pursue without, taking extreme risks and increasingly without breaking the law? From the other side of politics, though, it could be argued that transgression leads to a race to the bottom. That if we need to experience transgression as a form of pleasure in consumer culture, it will mean that social norms may be transgressed, but not in a necessarily progressive way, that we'll need more and more extreme forms of transgression. And, writers have kind of pointed to the notion and consumption of snuff films and stuff like that in particular in popular culture as an example of that. As kind of violence becomes more embedded in pop culture, that the need for it to be more extreme will become the norm, and there'll be kind of social problems attached to that. So, what this kind of way of thinking about consumption as transgression, as carnivalesque, points to the way that consumption itself is an embodied experience. We use our senses in the way that we consume. So sure, at the simplest biological level, the very act of eating is, an act of absorption. We absorb the food, we kind of become what we eat. Again, in that Borgesian sense. In this sense, the body itself is a dynamic project. We are what we eat, we are what we wear, we are how we exercise, we are the things that we like. Some theorists point that this is can be a form of discipline, a kind of Foucauldian technology of the self, where, pursuing these means inscribes a certain way of living, of discipline, of having to be healthy, and this takes work and produces a particular kind of moral sense. A moral self, and again, this kind of many arguing that the kind of call to be healthy, to be moral, to be wellness and all that kind of stuff is a way of neoliberalizing individuals to be better workers and better consumers. So this kind of points to the notion of biopower in particular, the way that our bodies are embedded in expert discourses that kind of manage the way that we live. Very broadly here, in terms of food and sensation, again, the cultural norms around this, I think, are very interesting in terms of the way that we think about pleasure. At the moment on television, there's a heap of shows about people going around the world and kind of eating kind of foods that are not normal. Whether that's I don't know, chicken feet in Southeast Asia or goat's blood soup in Africa and all this kind of stuff. And it seems to be we get some kind of pleasure in witnessing people eat that food that we probably wouldn't eat ourselves. And maybe that's a good example of that kind of desire for more and more extreme forms of consumption in that sense. But on a general level, we can think about the way that food and therefore the very experience of it again is socially constructed, as I mentioned earlier on. We don't eat dogs. Why are we so offended when the Japanese eat whales? So, here, the processes of making a food civilized, acceptable and amenable to us is a cultural stamp or imprint onto unknown territory, effectively turning nature into culture. And so I'll be discussing that divide a lot in the week on Nature Inc. in particular. So eating the flesh of other humans is obviously widely unacceptable, yet the flesh of some animals is more acceptable as food than others. Some animals are more apparently eatable in some cultures than others. So this is like how very, very obvious indications of how cultural processes work to create norms, and turns what one Chinese man described as the putrefied mucus discharge of animal guts into what Westerners see as cheese. So again, something that Westerners see and eat on a day-to-day basis from another culture is seen as disgusting. The other kind of social construction of food itself is the very way that we eat it. Why don't we just rip into our food and shovel it into our mouths? Why do we need manners, and why do we have to, eat with knives and forks and have napkins and all this kind of stuff? Again, the critical perspective in this, and both from Bourdieu or Foucault or others, will kind of point out how these need for manners are a form of discipline that reward some forms of kind of cultural behaviour over others, and they obviously distinguish about what we think is acceptable to eat. Our relation to these norms will fundamentally affect the way that we enjoy food or not. Now, again, this could be if you go to someone's home that is particularly decorated in a way they don't like, but the space might be any good. They might ideate different foods to you or cook it in a different way. This will obviously mean that you enjoy the meal much less if it's as opposed to maybe the way that you're used to it in your own house or with people like you. Food in this sense becomes a key way that people relate to each other, and again relates back to that notion of taste classifiers and a classifier's a classifier. And in conclusion this week, I'd really like you to remember some of the ways of thinking about the experience and sensations of consumer culture covered in this week when I look at the later week in the course of the way that tourism is now a form of consumption and how that sets up particular relations between nature and culture. Okay, thanks.